This is a recording from a Sunday meeting of the BC Humanist Association in Vancouver. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the BCHA or its board of directors. To learn more about humanism and to support our work, visit bchumanist.ca, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and be sure to subscribe to the BC Humanist podcast.
Today, we have Steve Thompson, who's going to talk to us about bitcoins and blockchain. Okay, if you haven't heard about it, it's really interesting.
Right, so thank you all for coming. I'd just like to kick off by making a sort of a poll. Who in this room has heard of Bitcoin? Okay, right. Who has actually used Bitcoin in a transaction? Oh, I got you that time. And who has heard of the blockchain? Right. Okay. So hopefully in this talk I'll help to fill in a few gaps, because it's a massive subject and it's constantly moving. So I'm going to talk about what Bitcoin is and how it works. I'd also give a few little facts about Bitcoin and essentially who does what, because there are humans involved in this thing. And I'm going to compare Bitcoin with banks and also currencies, just to give you a signpost into how Bitcoin fits into the system. And then I will go on to talk about the blockchain itself, because the blockchain is the network that powers Bitcoin. But I'll go into more details about that in this talk. And then I'll say who uses it now, and a few comments about just what the future holds. So I'll just start off by giving, I suppose, a bit of an autobiography of how I myself got into Bitcoin in the first place. I first heard about Bitcoin in the spring of 2013, and a few weeks later I went on to purchase my first couple of Bitcoins. And I have to say the whole subject it really did arouse my curiosity. I knew about the problems with the banking system, and so this whole Bitcoin space, I felt that it had a great deal of potential, but even back then I knew that there was so much to learn about it, and it did strike me that I could just make a little personal fortune out of Bitcoin if I got in at the right time. Because at the time I got into Bitcoin, the Bitcoin price was $120 per Bitcoin. But I'll show you shortly just how fast the price has been moving, even before I came in and even afterwards. And so it's sort of that was my pull into Bitcoin, but it's also been a push away from the banking system, because at the time I was also trying to find a savings account which could pay me a decent interest rate, and as we all know, the interest rates have been trending to almost zero, so it's been very difficult to find a savings account. So that was my push away from the banking system. And here in Vancouver, I've got into contact with a very good community that is looking into Bitcoin, and is also interested in various other topics around it. So before I talk about Bitcoin itself, I think it's helpful to talk about the internet itself, because if it wasn't for the internet, this Bitcoin currency, it would not exist. So my reading of the internet is that it's a vast platform of digital artifacts of varying types of value. it's got the little things like the YouTube trolls and such like, but it also houses vast delivery platforms like supply chains, and also libraries use the internet as well. And it's brought a new kind of delivery system called it just in time. Right, so in that context, I'll just go on to define what Bitcoin is. It's a cryptocurrency, and that means it's an encrypted money platform that's set across the globe. And there's a Bitcoin entrepreneur by the name of Andreas Antonopoulos, who has conceived of this idea of the Internet of Money. And now you may have heard of the Internet of Things, this new generation of devices that connect with the Internet. Well, this Bitcoin has been termed as the Internet of Money, and it can send and receive value just like an email. So it's part of a vast messaging system. It's another vital component of Bitcoin is that it's decentralized, and that means it's also not under patent either. So nobody owns it, and so this means that that there are no intermediaries like any kind of bank or the money changing companies like Western Union, who charge high fees for currency conversion. But one point I'd like to make about Bitcoin is that it reconnects currency with production. And what I mean by that is in comparison as with the way in which national currencies are created. In that, I'm sure you've heard of the trend of money printing and quantitative easing. A lot of these national currencies are created just literally as Control P in print. The currency is now being used as a means to bail out banks or to prop up the stock market. So it's lost its connection as with hard assets. So the thing with Bitcoin, and I'll illustrate this soon, is that Bitcoins are created as a result of the efforts of the miners, another group of people who I'll be talking about soon, who actually mine these Bitcoins. And so Bitcoin is and the miners get a reward for the mining. So the thing with Bitcoin is that it is rewarded into existence, and this follows through on the supply of Bitcoins, in which there's a finite supply. It has a cap of 21 million Bitcoins. That's the maximum number that can exist. And so far, 3/4 of them have been mined. And it's projected that the last Bitcoin is going to be created in 2044. So I wonder who will be around to see it. So on definitions about what Bitcoin is. So this system is based on a consensus system on the integrity of transactions, but it's a shame that there's no consensus among countries about just what this is. So here in Canada, it's termed as a virtual currency, and there's an oblique reference to it in British Columbia that has defined Bitcoin. Well, it doesn't define Bitcoin directly, but it refers to intangible assets. And if you go onto the Personal Property Security Act, you'll see a reference to intangible assets. In my own country, the UK, and Australia, and Norway, it's termed as property. Hong Kong has defined it as a virtual currency, and Russia has defined it as a foreign currency. Now, if you were to ask an official in the US, you'll have to choose your agency, because whichever way you go, as you always find a different kind of definition. So it ranges from a commodity through to property, and it's also defined as a convertible decentralized virtual currency, which I'm sure makes things a lot clearer. So the thing that crossed my mind at the time when I bought my first bitcoins is this thing going to be illegal soon? Am I going to get my house raided at some point? At the moment, so far so good. In Canada, it's regulated under the area of tax reporting, and both my country and in the United States, it's unregulated. Now, the thing with China and Russia is that their positions are very interesting in that in China, and it's perfectly fine for an individual to hold bitcoins, but and also trade them, but not financial firms for some reason. And in Russia, although it's illegal to hold and trade those bitcoins domestically, it's perfectly legal to hold and trade them internationally. So it seems that there's a notion of authority over these bitcoins in both China and Russia, but it looks as though those two countries have enabled a workaround. So how would you go about purchasing these bitcoins, and what actually happens? Well, I'll just refer you back to my own personal experience with them. The first port of call, the first point at which you get, in which you come across bitcoins, are through these websites called exchanges, and this is where you go to purchase your bitcoins. But it's also at this stage where you go through all the know your customer provisions. So I had to upload a digital photograph of myself. I had to upload a government-issued ID, and I also had to upload a recent utilities bill, or anything that could, or any other sheet which displayed my home address. So it's got those three elements to it. Now, there are various options in which you can hold bitcoins. You can, and in fact, you can just leave them on the exchange itself and treat it like almost like having a bank account. But the thing which attracted me a lot about Bitcoin is that it's possible to hold them directly. And this is where the wallet comes in. So this wallet is, again, it's a digital artifact which sits on your computer, and it can hold these bitcoins. So you can either hold them online on a computer that connects to the internet, or you can hold them onto a computer that doesn't connect to the internet. A whole range of options. You can also take them away from the digital area completely and hold them as a paper wallet, in which you would print out So these paper wallets are it's a 32-digit code which you can print out and then type back into your computer if you want to access those bitcoins. So this is getting into the area of cold storage. Now, if you're really paranoid, so you can hold them away from any kind of physical object at all. So you can keep them as a set of keywords, which you would keep. In fact, you would literally just memorize them. It's called a brain wallet. So the thing which I want to mention about the transactions themselves is that these transactions get broadcast onto the blockchain, and all of these transactions are completely visible to the public, and they don't require you to upload your identity. So just once you're in the Bitcoin space, there's no further need for you to declare who you are, because from that point on, your identity is expressed only as a Bitcoin address, which is a 16-digit alphanumeric code. And the network is entirely encrypted, and so there's a much reduced risk of identity theft. much less so than holding it in a bank. So a bit of history, just briefly a bit of history. This Bitcoin has existed since 2009, and so has the blockchain network, and it's not been hacked into yet, but it's only had one instance of downtime, and that was in 2010 for a couple of hours. But apart from that, in the blockchain's eight-year history, it's turned out to be very resilient. But there have been a lot of attempts to hack into this blockchain, including an agent from the National Security Agency in the US. He had a go, but he couldn't get in. There's a lot of mystery surrounding Bitcoin in who had actually conceived of the network in the first place. There's a guy called Satoshi Nakamoto, and there's even some speculation about if this is an actual person, if it was a group of people, maybe. But all we know is that he authored a white paper in 2009 about Bitcoin as a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And it's been, at first glance, it looks like another currency, but after reading the white paper, you come to realize that it operates more like a network. So, just a word on how the price has behaved. It's started from literally zero. Yeah, I'm quite glad the chart has opened up. So I'll just show you I'm going to show you the numbers. As we start from zero here, and the chart goes up to $1,200. And this chart begins at the beginning of 2013. But in 2009, it began as a tiny fraction of a cent. It was 0.0001. So that was the amount of cents it required to purchase a Bitcoin at those early stages. But ever since then, the price has grown incredibly in such a short space of time. So in April 2013, at the time when I came in, it had already grown to $120 per Bitcoin. But then in the fall of 2013, and in fact the fun really started, for some reason or another, the price had shot up to $1,200 per Bitcoin. And I remember feeling quite panicky about that, because I thought to myself, anytime soon this Bitcoin is going to become illegal. It has to be shut down, surely. But in the end, it's turned out to be a bit of an anticlimax, because after 2014, 2014 the price fell again. We also got the failure of a large Bitcoin exchange called Mt. Gox. It was until the end of 2013, it was pretty much the only place where you could purchase Bitcoins, apart from a couple of other exchanges. But we saw the failure of Mt. Gox at around that time, and after that the price began to fall down. I'll just go on to this. So onto this 2013 to 2015 period. It's actually been a period of consolidation, because back in because at the end of 2013 there were only 4,000 vendors which actually offered services in Bitcoin. There was WordPress and 4chan, a blogging site, and I think 4chan is some kind of social media site. But apart from that, there were no household names involved in Bitcoin. But by 2015, there were over 100,000 organizations which offer some kind of payment or another in Bitcoin, of other services. So you have organizations like Expedia, Greenpeace, and even Microsoft have offered services in Bitcoin. So I'll just run a comparison in between Bitcoin and the banking system. The thing with Bitcoin is that it's a decentralized system. That's one of the core characteristics. of Bitcoin. Now, compared with the banking system, the banking system is a centralized system, and it's run from another messaging center, a bit like with blockchain, SWIFT, and this is the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. So it's it reports on all of the financial transactions made in the banking system. And just to take an example of one of the major payment systems on Visa, it runs 45,000 transactions per second. And this is compared with Bitcoin, which measures in at 7 transactions per second. But Visa operates under the advantage that a lot of these transactions are in fact on credit cards. There's no credit issued in Bitcoin. But on those transactions, the clearance is much faster than on the standard payment systems. A transaction is cleared in minutes, whereas on Visa, if you were to buy something on a Thursday, it would not necessarily appear on your bank account until on the Monday morning. So the transaction clearance takes a lot longer, and the total assets which Visa holds is approaching $200 billion. So this is compared with Bitcoin's total assets, which measure up at $10 billion. Now, this sounds very modest at first, but this time last year, the total value of assets denominated in Bitcoin was only 3.6 billion. So it's grown by 3 times in just 1 year. Another difference is that with Bitcoin you can hold your wallet directly, and in fact you can literally operate as your own central bank, as they say. Whereas with a bank account, the bank actually owns the money in your account. It owns them on the liability side of the bank's balance sheet. Also, in the banking system, as I'm sure you're aware by now, on the standard checking accounts, you can expect various types of fees. In fact, you pay a fee for exceeding a certain amount of transactions in a given month, or if your balance goes down under a certain threshold. But in fact, that doesn't happen under Bitcoin. And in fact, although there are transaction fees, they are very tiny. So I've been flying at about 5,000 feet here. So I'm just going to go up a bit to 50,000 feet, if you like. In fact, the world's GDP is approaching $110 trillion. It's an unimaginable amount. Whereas Bitcoin, it's completely dwarfed by the size of national currencies. But the thing with currencies is that there is an infinite supply. So in Japan, for instance, they have quantitative easing to infinity. There's no limit to the quantity of yen that can now be produced. And as I mentioned earlier with Bitcoin, that there is a restricted supply, and that's based on a diminishing reward that's paid out to the miners. So in currency, that should be inflationary. It should lead to higher prices. It's certainly in fact, quantitative easing has been termed as hypermonetary inflation, but we've not yet reached the hyper price inflation yet. In Bitcoin, the trend is deflationary. So on Bitcoin, given that there is a limit of the number of Bitcoins which can exist, it means that supply has a much greater influence over the value of Bitcoin, a greater influence than supply has over fiat currency. In fact, almost all the national currencies are termed as fiat currency. In fact, the word fiat comes from the Latin term "it is done." So it's a set value. It refers to a set value. And also national currencies are issued as debt. They are issued by private banks as loans. and they can be issued by governments in the form of sovereign bonds. The miners, so just going back to Bitcoin, the miners mine the blocks and receive the Bitcoins as a reward. And so it's issued as a result of computational effort on the part of these miners in their efforts to mine the blocks, and then they get the reward in the form of Bitcoins. And finally, on currencies, you only have your central bank's word on the currency's integrity. Whereas on Bitcoin, each transaction which is made in the Bitcoin space is authenticated by thousands of users around the world. So I've talked a few times about mining. So I just do a bit of a show and tell of a couple of mining rigs. It's essentially a very powerful computer. You have all these graphics cards stacked against each other, a good number of fans and power supplies as well. So I don't know how much electricity this mining rig is going to generate. But the idea is that the value of the Bitcoin actually exceeds the cost of the energy. But I just compare this homemade mining rig with this beast. This is from a facility in China, and these are rows upon rows of machines, and these are all mining these Bitcoins. And in fact, at the moment, the vast majority of Bitcoins which are being, and in fact, the vast majority of the blocks which are being mined, in which Bitcoins are rewarded, are in fact coming out of China. The second biggest supply of Bitcoins is coming from the United States, but it's a very, very distant second. It's almost as though the Chinese are cornering Bitcoin. So finally, I just go on to talk about the network, and this is the Bitcoin blockchain. This is the name of the network which powers Bitcoin, the currency. It's several things. It operates as a decentralized protocol. It's a platform of trust. It's a network and authentication system, and it's and also a publicly accessible encrypted ledger. And it's and this blockchain is a database. It's at the moment the size is 80 gigs, and it's distributed across thousands of computers around the world. So so I think the best definition of the blockchain which I've come across so far comes from the chief executive of Digital Asset Holdings. It's a consultancy which advises banks about the blockchain and how they might create their own how they might create their own versions of the blockchain. And she's quoted as saying that the blockchain itself is a shared and replicated source of the same information that stays the same at all points in time. So it's based on the direct ownership of an asset, and it's also open source, which means that anyone can view the code. And it's also led to a great deal of innovation as well, in that a lot of mobile apps have been developed which enable the buying and also transmission of Bitcoins. It's permissionless and trustless. Now, I just want to explain what trustless means. It doesn't mean untrustworthy. It means that this network doesn't require verification from any kind of centralized authority. So I'll just go very briefly about the way the blockchain works. It sort of runs on two kind of levels: by the individual transaction, and also the record of a set of transactions which are compressed into a series of blocks. So at the transaction level, as both the miners and the network are able to establish proof that the transaction had completed. Each transaction is also given a time-stamped hash timestamp hash value, and that's broadcast to the database. But the way in which it works, but the way in which it becomes a database, which makes sense to people, is that every 20 minutes, the miners create these blocks of 1 meg's worth of transactions, also timestamped. But each of them are given two identifiers. So these identifiers are also known as hash values. So a new block takes the hash value of the preceding block, and then it's given a second hash value, and that's entirely new. And so that second hash value is then transferred to the following block. So you've got this daisy chain of clusters of transactions, and that's how they get the name the blockchain. And this makes the blockchain very difficult to alter, as without invalidating any newly created blocks. Now, among all the hype and the euphoria that took place from 2013 to 2015, as we let ourselves think that the blockchain was immutable, that it couldn't be altered. But over the last year or so, it has been proved that it can be altered, but under very controlled circumstances. So I'll just run very quickly on who all these people are, and because I've mentioned I've mentioned the miners and the exchanges in passing, but so here they are in more detail. So I'm just going to start right from the supply end and working our way down to the kind of things that we see. So there is a set of developers called Bitcoin Core. It's a large open source community that ensures that the blockchain is working properly and checks the integrity of the blocks. You have the miners, which actually create the blocks. So they mine them by means of solve them by these mathematical problems, which take a certain amount of computational effort. And they validate each transaction and enter it into the network in these batches known as blocks. It's a kind of works in the form of safety in numbers, in that the more miners there are, and in fact the more secure this network becomes. And there are various computers which also go on to broadcast these transactions, and these are known as the nodes. We also have these Bitcoin exchanges, which is are these online marketplaces where you can purchase Bitcoins and you can also sell them. Now, this blockchain has also created a large new service class consisting of startups and third parties, and they've all set up to carry out some kind of service based on the blockchain. So you have there are hundreds of these startups, which so it's and the number is growing. And it's constantly growing. And finally, we have us, we have us, and it's those people who use the network. So I mentioned a wide range of use cases, and it runs from the area of microfinance and remittances, which is very useful for people who either live or work abroad. All these use cases have been based on the blockchain, so it can be either Bitcoin, but not always. And one good example of this non-Bitcoin use, in fact, one very good example of a blockchain-based service that did not use Bitcoin is the case of Honduras. on its land registry. It broadcasts all of its transactions as a kind of an experiment onto the blockchain. But that particular enterprise, it ran for a few months, but was abandoned. Also in Australia, the country is researching into putting the stock market onto the blockchain. It may sound like a tall task, but in Australia, their stock market is entirely digital. So it wouldn't be as much of a long shot as, say, if the United States or the UK had tried to put their stock markets onto the blockchain. And then you have other sectors such as insurance claims, energy grid management, also legal services and copyright, all things which involve the transfer of digital value. So are possible candidates for entry onto the blockchain. So a few words about the future. I'm optimistic about the future. I think it's very exciting. It's generating a lot of innovation, and some vendors have come forward and experimented with it. And in fact, some experiments have succeeded. Other experiments have not been so successful. But I think the sum total is that all of us are learning, and that these ideas can only get stronger. I think in terms of mass adoption, I think it'll be a combination of a new generation of mobile apps in which they can bring a human face to the Bitcoin currency. It's also very possible to have a retail network, and in fact deliver it on the blockchain, and also in the area of micropayments. And in fact, an interesting property about Bitcoin is that it's completely divisible. So it's possible to pay for something at a thousandth or a millionth of a Bitcoin. And so if you were to go onto your Netflix, if Netflix were ever to experiment with the blockchain, they could sell a few seconds of content. But I think most of it is going to rely on public recognition of Bitcoin. It can be. I imagine quite a few people. I imagine they'll have some expectation of what Bitcoin should be, and will compare it against national currencies. It won't have any elite spaces on it. Let's put it that way. So that's the end of my talk, and here are some sources if you're interested.